If you can stay with me. As I mentioned, when was it? Yesterday, we're missionaries to the city of Iquitos. Let me see. Can you try to see what you can see? Okay. It's a city of between 500 to 700,000 people in the middle of the Amazon jungle. It's surrounded on 3 sides by rivers, sometimes on 4 sides. So it's kind of a peninsula, but sometimes it's an island. It's the second most isolated major city in the world. You can only get there by airplane or by boat. There are no roads connecting Iquitos to the outside world. It's a city, but this is a scene that you can see from the city. There's a street that goes right along the river, and this is what you see. So the jungle is all around the city, and the rivers are all around the city. They tell you to never end a picture presentation, slide presentation with a sunset scene. So I'm going to just put it at the beginning because I just like this picture of Iquitos, at sunset. We went back to Peru, different than what we did before. We were working in multiple churches, going around to different churches, helping them out. But we came up with a new plan, and we said, we're going to go to one church at a time, a church that needs help to get to the next level, a church that has a pastor, but they need to get to the point where they're thinking about planting other churches and thinking about missions, supporting missionaries, starting missionary movements. And so there were some candidates, but we finally decided to go with this church called Permanecer, which means abide in English. And it was a small, new church, and we were meeting in a home. A lady gave up the front of her home, a fairly large space, consider it. And so this is the front of the church. And at that time, the street was still dirt. Now, today, as we speak, it's all cement, and there's traffic and that kind of thing. The pastor and his wife, Richard and Carla, we already knew them, that they're a young family. Carla is from a region of Peru that is very beautiful. There are a lot of German people and Swiss people that settled there years ago. It's a super fertile area. And so she met Richard, I think, at Bible school. Richard is from the jungle. They have 2 children. And so we decided to help them. It was a long process, but I don't have time to tell you how the Lord just directed us to work with them. So there were times where Richard and Carla had to go to the capital to raise support, to kind of do furlough type of stuff, and sometimes there were medical needs. And so there were times where for months I was the pastor, and Carol was the pastor's wife. And I think this was at an anniversary that we were having. I think John and Wendy are actually in that picture. Carol worked with the children, and so they did different children's programs. She was there for Sunday school. How many children would come sometimes, Carol, like on a regular basis? 35. Sometimes I heard that even 50 kids would come. But this was the Easter program, I think, right? And so the kids really got into that. Then we had a growing youth group. These are only some of the young people. The picture is not very clear, but to give you an idea, we had a lot of young people, many of them new believers. Because this was a relatively new church, and because a lot of the members or the people that attended were new believers, everything was really exciting and new. It was like being part of a New Testament church. And things like baptisms and weddings and even communion. It was all new and exciting to them. So this was a baptism service we had where 2 ladies were baptized. I think here is another picture from an anniversary type of... we have some of the church members that wanted to get a picture up front in front of the church. We weren't able to help the church get to the next level where they began supporting missionaries to different countries around the world and praying for other missionaries as well. And they have a missionary board, and they were thinking about, and they were starting to go to other communities to think about planting other churches in other areas. But this, the young lady that's in the white, she is a missionary to Israel. She's from Peru, from the jungle, and she is one of the missionaries that church, Patton-Field, took on. And here we are. She was visiting from Israel, and she has a really unique ministry there. I also taught or teach courses at the Bible Institute, and here I am with some of the teachers. John obviously is not there, and there were a couple more professors that were missing. So that was one of the other things that I would do, but usually just one class at a time because my schedule was really busy. We work with like about 3 associations of churches. 2 of them Baptist church associations. One of them, the largest, has roughly between 30 and 35 member churches. And so they'll have their conference, and this is a picture of one of the conferences. And that's only maybe half of the people that were there when they all get together and have an association conference. Carol, I want to talk a lot about Carol. Carol just, was involved in so many things. With the women's choir, we have a choir that's like an association choir, so it's a citywide choir. And there she is with some of her friends, and they would sing at conferences and at different churches, and they would have the Women's Congress in different cities. Once a year, they have the Baptist Women's Conference, and where they'll have hundreds and hundreds of women coming from all over Peru. And so here they are at another large church, and they had a lot of fun, and they were able to minister to a lot of people. Carol was also involved with, or connected with, women's associations of specific churches. So here she's with Calvario, which is Calvary, where my parents used to work, and she was always invited to their different special activities. This was for Valentine's Day, which they call Friendship Day. She also helps with VBS type of activities. So here she is with one of the teams that were doing VBS for children. She also did things with women. This is a retreat, a women's retreat. And you got to watch out for those women can be pretty crazy. They're out there, with the piranhas and everything else, but the piranhas got to be careful of those ladies. They had some kind of a beauty pageant, the Queen of the Amazon or something, and actually Carol won, so they dressed up in these funny get-ups. But she was also involved with the women's, I guess you call it the Women's Association of the whole city. And here they're having an activity at our Bible Institute. And here's just a few of the many women that are involved in that. At our age, we sort of became grandparents and surrogate parents to many young couples. Our kids were going out of the nest, but then all of a sudden these young couples would come over to our house, and they wanted us to, love on their kids. And so the babies are taking over. The babies are taking over dominion of everything. They're just everywhere. And so we've had the privilege of mentoring and helping many young couples. Carol was really involved in this ministry that is really big at Christmas time, where they have these teams. This is actually a small team because they went to a river village, where they go and do these Christmas programs. They'll do them at public schools, private schools, at churches, in plazas, in public squares, and they give out the gospel. They have puppets, all kinds of things where they evangelize the children, and they reach thousands of children every Christmas time. And they have hot chocolate and the fruit bread, and that always draws the kids. But she was heavily involved in that. Here's another team going to a poor neighborhood, and our kids, when they were in town, would help out. Because they go back all the way back to when they were kids. One of the things that happened this last term that we were there is our co-worker, Lynn Porter, who worked with the deaf, who had been a missionary there for years. She was an MK that I grew up with. She passed away from cancer. She left the area, and I was left with the responsibility. We were left with the responsibility to settle up all her affairs and sell her home and just take care of everything, because we knew she probably was never going to come back. And as it turned out, she never did. And she passed away. When did she pass away? Huh? At the end of March. But that was a big task that we had to do, to try to sell her home and close out all her accounts and take care of her belongings. But Carol had talked extensively to her before she went to the States about what she wanted done with all her things and you know, her friends and her money and everything. And she had such a tremendous impact in the deaf community. Everybody who was deaf knew who Lynn was, whether they were saved or not saved. And so she left a big vacant spot in our missionary team. Of course, as you know, John, Wendy, and the girls came and joined us this last year. And so then we had another family, missionary family in our team. One of the things that I was doing before John and Wendy got there is I would go on river trips to go and encourage the believers in different river towns. And so John and I went on a river trip, and see that grassy area behind the vehicles there? That was where my parents built a home in a village called Requena, where my brother Tom was born. He was actually born in our house. But you know what? They've built nothing there since. It's just like a vacant lot. I don't know why. But they've never gone back and built anything else on there. So it's just a grassy lot right there. But that's where our family, as kids, we grew up. We went to this town called Flor de Punga, where missionaries, including my parents, had spent a lot of time building this church. And so we went there for a conference for their anniversary. And you can see that the river is really close to that building. But it didn't used to be that way. This church used to be about 5-6 blocks away from the river. But the river started eating away at the town. A bunch of buildings went into the water. Streets went into the water. So when we got there, this building was going to be next. But God protected it. It never, all of a sudden the river diverted and it stopped eating away. But now they're building a new building as we speak. But we were able to visit with people. This couple worked with my parents when they were young adults. And they really wanted to see us, to see my parents' children, you know. So we were able to, there's John connecting with them. I was able to connect with some couples that worked with other missionaries that have already gone home to be with the Lord, and just hear their stories of how they used to work with the missionaries. It was really wonderful. I took 2 young men from our church, Patton-Field. The 2 guys that are on would be on the left-hand side, because I wanted them to get excited about missions. So there were 2 guys that grew up in the city, and I wanted to take them so that they could see that there are other believers and there are needs out there in the river, and I wanted them to connect with the people. And it turned out to be a hugely impactful trip for them. It was amazing to see how they kind of evolved, and they just got so excited about their Christianity and about getting involved in ministry and that kind of thing. We had to get a new home because John and Wendy moved into the home where we were. So this is a Christmas event with some more ladies that Carol had in our new home there in Iquitos. As I mentioned, we were at the Patton-Field church. Then we decided, you know what, it's time for us to move on. We need to choose another church. And so we were going back and forth. What kind of church are we going to go to? Where are we going to go to? And while we're in that process of identifying the next church, this one church called Oreb Church, that has existed for a long time. It's one of the larger, more influential churches. I've been without a pastor for 3 years, and it's a long story. They all of a sudden approached us and said, well, our leadership has had these meetings, a series of meetings, you know, our pulpit committee and all of that, and we have decided that we want you to become the interim pastor at our church. Of course, they had never said anything to me. It was just totally I was blindsided, you know? And so, wow, we had to make a difficult decision because they didn't have a pastor, they were well established, and so it was totally different than the model that we were thinking about. But the more we prayed, the more we consulted with different people, our missionary leadership, our home church, everyone said, we think you should do it. But of course, with this church, there was a lot of politics. It was totally different from Patton-Field, because here you had people that some of them had been believers for decades, and there was the old guard, and there was all these issues that were unresolved, and so we had to just jump into that. And so here's the youth group welcoming us to that church. And they have a large youth group, they have a large women's association, and we got to the point where I only had one free night a week, Thursday night. There was something going on every single night before COVID hit. But then, had to do baby dedications, there's communion, there's baptisms, there's weddings, all kinds of stuff. Like I said before, we got connected with a lot of young couples. So there's a lot of weddings that we had to go to, or a lot of weddings that I had to speak at, or ceremonies that I had to conduct. And I had the privilege of marrying this couple, Manuel, the guy. We had worked with him at a church years ago. He was a young man, where I was filling in also at another church as pastor. And I really, honestly, I never thought he was going to get married. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, I find out that he has a girlfriend, and the next thing I know, they want to get married. And then they asked me to marry them. It was an incredible experience. Now, if you look at this picture right here, see this guy sitting here? He's a young missionary guy, not with our mission, but another organization, Dustin. And he is early in the morning sitting there waiting to go into the grocery store. This is post the beginning of COVID. And when they locked down, Peru was the second country in the world to lock down, and they were the most locked down of any country in the world. And our region was the most locked down region in the world. And you can see these people are lying out on the street early in the morning because they want to be able to get into the bank. And these scenes played out every day, every day. The streets were eerily empty. No children. You wouldn't see any children anywhere. You wouldn't even hear their voices usually. And it was just so strange, and it was so restricted. And here's some more people waiting on another day at another bank, waiting to get in. These people are waiting. I think they were waiting to get their check, their whatever you call it in the States, stimulus or their aid check. And so this line was massive. And that's what we had to deal with. You could only go to the pharmacy, the grocery store, or the bank. That's it. Nothing else was open. No hardware stores, nothing. This brother Job, he was a student at the Bible Institute. He was a student of mine for a while. He had passed away 3 days before they found him. He was living alone. Maybe he had COVID. We don't know. But because no one was allowed to go anywhere, no one was allowed to visit anybody, check on anybody, and finally somebody just got the courage to find out what happened to him, and they found that he had passed away like 3 days before. This pastor here, who is a real dear friend of mine, he was also a student of mine. He was a graduate of our Bible Institute. He did die from COVID. We didn't even know he was sick. And then one day I was looking on Facebook, and I saw that he had passed away. I was just devastated, absolutely devastated. He was such a wonderful man. Then Pastor Maniwati, who had years of cooperating and working with our missionaries, he passed away. This pastor here, he got sick downriver, and the family wanted him to go to Iquitos to get treatment. He said, no, you know what? If the Lord wants me to live, He'll make me live right here in this town, but I'm not going to the big city. Well, he eventually died from COVID. There was a point in time in Iquitos where there was someone dying every hour from COVID. This pastor, one of the biggest churches, also a professor at our Bible Institute, Juan Hoyos, he got sick with COVID and he was in the hospital. He was really bad off for at least a month. But God miraculously healed him, and he's now fine. Pastor Carlos, same thing. He got deathly ill, and we really didn't know if he was going to make it, but then he was able to recover. Walter, who was also the music teacher at our Bible Institute, a mechanic, a friend, he came down with COVID, but he was able to recuperate as well. Pastor Sandoval, he had other physical issues. He ended up being in the hospital how many months? 3 months or 2 months? His daughter, Tessie, the one that's without all the blue stuff there, standing there, she had to go into the hospital, and she had to stay there while her younger brother was on the outside. And she was there the entire time her father was hospitalized. And what she did, though, she started ministering to the nurses and the doctors and the other patients. And here she's leading them all in prayer. It was incredible. It was tremendous, the impact and the testimony that she had. One of the biggest needs, one of the main causes for people dying was there was no access to oxygen. If they had just had oxygen, they would have survived. And so there was a scarcity of oxygen, and a tank like this, if you bought it, it was $1,000. And what Tessie had to do is she had to be on the inside with a tank of oxygen. Her brother had to be on the outside with an empty tank, and you would wait for 9 hours in line, hoping that they would fill the tank. As soon as they filled the tank, he would rush back to the hospital, switch the tanks, and start the whole process over again. And he also had to buy all the medicine and take all the food and everything for his father and give it to his sister, and then she would take it into the hospital. And that's just an example of what so many people live through. I saw young people, young men especially, aged years before, just in front of my eyes. They aged like 6 years right in front of me, even though we're talking about 2 or 3 months. This is a truck outside of the regional hospital, which became the epicenter for COVID treatment, and is full of caskets waiting out there. This is a nurse who just had to escape for a while because she was so overcome with everything. So she's out there trying to take a break, trying to gather her thoughts, because it was just devastating to all the medical personnel. But we had a lot of missionary friends that stayed. This family here, the Mahones, they're actually from England, but they're still there. They decided to stay there, and so we pray for them. Of course, a lot of them are younger, but they were able to stay and continue on ministry. We eventually were able to evacuate. The U.S. government helped us, but we had many failed attempts at leaving. The planes had mechanical problems, or we had to let other people go instead of us, give them preference. And so we didn't know when we were going to get out of there. And then finally, the U.S. State Department was able to negotiate with the Peruvian Air Force, and the Air Force said, okay, we'll take some of the Americans from the jungle. And so this was the plane we went on. And they sprayed us down from head to toe, even the bottoms of our shoes, all of our luggage. They sprayed our little lamb chop, everything. And then when we got in the plane, I was on one side and Carol was on the other side. It was that kind of thing. And then we waited for 2 hours. We didn't know why. And it was for some little kid that they were waiting for. But we finally left. But we were very sad because this is John and Wendy's house, which used to be our house. And this is Miss Teo, who is watching their house and our animals, like the dog right there. And she and her son live there, and they watch over the property, and they take care of the animals, the rabbit and the cat and the 2 dogs. And we pray for them, Teo and David. We really miss them. They're just so wonderful. So there's Lamb Chop looking out the window. It started raining when we were going to leave Iquitos. Lamb Chop was very sad to leave Iquitos, as were we. Very sad. This is in Lima at the U.S. Embassy, where they processed us. The U.S. government, the State Department, even the Peruvian military, just were fantastic. They were fantastic. They were so helpful, and so it was incredible. But we were taken in a caravan of like 8 buses, and we had this full police escort out to the Air Force base where our plane left. This is the plane that we left on. Actually, that's a picture that John took, but because they left a couple weeks before us, and we took this plane to Miami. And I couldn't believe it. Once we were on that plane, I couldn't believe that we were actually out of the country, because it really looked really sketchy for us to be able to leave the country. So pray for the city of Iquitos and the surrounding area. Whereas before it was the worst hit with COVID, now it's the most COVID-resistant area perhaps in the world. Because they figure that between 70 and 90% of the population have all been exposed to COVID, and they're all immune. So that's not an issue. It's other things like dengue fever and other stuff that's a problem. So we left because, we weren't planning on coming to the States anyway, but we left because our mission and the leadership of our Peru team said, you guys are in the most vulnerable area in the world, and you're in the most isolated area in the world, And we don't know what's going to happen in the future. There's going to be security issues. There could be a financial crisis. There's definitely a medical crisis. If we had, I was in a hit and run accident 5 days before we were evacuated. I was on a motorcycle and a guy ran a red light, smashed into me, sent me flying, the motorcycle flying, and all that. And so when I was on the trip to the States, I was still, nursing my wounds and everything. But it's because they were only unlicensed people. They weren't following the rules of traffic and everything. So pray for Iquitos and the surrounding areas as they try to recover economically and so forth, and that the restrictions will start to be lifted. We hope to go back as well, A, as soon as they open up the country for flights from the United States, and B, there's some things that we really want to accomplish in terms of helping our children get settled before we go back. But then we want to go back every day. So, but God's timing is perfect. He knows what we need to do before we go back. So, I don't know how long that was. I think I'm done. Am I forgetting anything? Okay.